All my political life, I've had to follow Bob Dole and Pat Roberts. It's a challenge, and they have a sense of humor and a wit that I've never been able to replicate. And they have big shoes to fill that are impossible to accomplish. Never in my time in public life, and therefore in any portion of my life, have I felt more nervous, less capable of delivering a message. But it's an important one, and I'm honored so much, so privileged to be able to speak in this setting. I'm delighted that our minority leader, the Republican leader of the Senate, and his wife Elaine are with us. From day one, Mitch has said, "I will be in Kansas." I asked him, "So did you have a relationship with Bob Dole? Did you like him?" To which he said, "Jerry, I voted for him 5 times. When I arrived in the United States Senate, there was a leadership election going on, and it took 5 ballots to elect Bob Dole, the majority leader. And I did it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times." Then he went on to say what I think is the important point of that story. He said, "I was a new staffer for a new senator when Bob Dole was in the Senate, and I was leaning against the back wall of the United States Senate, and the only one of those 5 candidates who ever visited with me was Bob Dole. And I repaid the favor for his paying attention to somebody he had no necessity of talking to by voting for him. And he became the majority leader, as I understand it, by 1 vote. It tells us a story about Mitch's loyalty, but it tells us a story about Bob Dole. You may remember, I don't know that it's done these days, but there used to be polls of people who work in the Capitol. And the question was, who's your favorite senator? Who's the politest person? Who's respectful? Bob Dole, every time. To the elevator operator, the person who drives the train, to the staff up and down the halls, Bob Dole was their favorite. And Senator Kassebaum, I'm delighted you're here. There are many people who appreciate and long for the days in which Bob Dole and Nancy Kassebaum were their senators. Those were days of glory for Kansas because we were represented so well. There's lots of Dole alumni in this room, people whose lives were affected by the fact they worked for Bob Dole, therefore they worked for Kansans, they worked for Americans. And they have done so many good things in their life, and they come to pay respect to their mentor, the person who gave them a chance, who brought them from Kansas to the nation's capital and changed their lives. Chaplain Black, I certainly appreciated what you said yesterday in the National Cathedral, but what you said today in St. Mary's in Russell, Kansas is meaningful. This is a place in which you can preach the gospel of salvation, and people are receptive. And Elizabeth Dole, we have so many things that we could compliment you on in your public service, your service in the United States Senate, your service in the cabinet. But I have no doubt that the ability for Chaplain Black to say, "a brother in Christ," has a lot to do with your relationship and with Senator Dole. And there is no better thing that could be said today. All the accolades about Bob Dole's life are irrelevant until you get to the point that the chaplain made, "my brother in Christ." We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Romans 5:3-4. I travel Kansas a lot, and there are so many stories about Bob Dole. Each of us, we'd love to tell them. I've suggested that we ought to get a group together, get a cup of coffee, have a sandwich, and just tell Dole stories. Bob Dole is the first United States Senator I ever met. My hometown of Plainville, neighboring county, knew of him, but then the first senator I ever had the chance to shake a hand with. And I have been in awe of Bob Dole for 52 years since then. I know him personally, but I know him from the way Kansans talk about him, the way they express their views about what he did for them, what he meant to them, how important he was to them. If there's a role model in public service, isn't it about getting to the point in which people say, you meant something to me? I hope those days are not past, in which the connection between elected officials and the people they represent are about what we've done to make their lives better. My story with Bob Dole begins when he was serving our nation in uniform. In the spring of 1945, not me, but when the spring of 1945, a worried mother, Mina Dole, called my grandma. My grandparents lived south of here on the Russell-Barton County line. The way it was described to me, the conversation took place on a party line. And Mrs. Dole was asking my grandmother, could you please ask your son to see what happened to Bob in the battlefields of Italy? My dad was also serving in Italy. He was serving in the army. And she expressed this hope to my grandmother, my dad's mom, that maybe my dad could learn something about what happened to Bob Dole and how he was doing and what his chances were. My dad took leave and made the effort to find Bob Dole, only to discover that he had been evacuated out the day before. He missed seeing him by a day. I walked out of church last Sunday, a week ago tomorrow, only to learn the news of Senator Dole's passing. And I want folks to know that every time I think of Bob Dole, I think of Russell. I think of places like Russell. Towns like Russell, some a little bit bigger, some a little bit smaller, dot our state. In each of these towns, there are differences of opinions. There are Republicans and there's Democrats. There's people who go to this church or that church. But you know, when it comes to communities in Kansas, communities like Russell, we set aside our differences and try to solve problems. Maybe in a place like Russell, you could actually have a kid who grew up in the Trinity Methodist Church have his funeral service at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Maybe you could actually have the Methodists and the Lutherans singing in the choir together. I've tried to explain this to my colleagues in Washington, D.C. more than once, but there's something about small towns where we still get along, and get along well enough to solve our problems. Less so, unfortunately, in the nation's capital. We respect our neighbors. We see them in the grocery store and we see them at the football game on Friday night. And if we fought among ourselves all the time, like sometimes national politics exhibits today, our towns would be a thing of the past. It's only that community working together that keeps a place alive. And we put our hands over our heart when the flag goes by, and we love our country. Following the attack of December 7th, 80 years ago this week, the values Bob Dole learned growing up in Russell led him to sign up and to swear an oath to protect and defend our nation. In the fall of 1944, Lieutenant Dole shipped out, and on April 14th of the next year, 1945, on a battlefield in the hills of Italy, his life almost ended. It began here in Russell and almost ended in a place he probably never envisioned ever seeing, some set of hills in some country called Italy. And sadly, his injuries occurred 3 weeks before the war came to an end. Those injuries he suffered were horrific, and they were permanent, but he survived, he endured a long road to recovery. 3 years of healing, therapy, rehabilitation still left him with a severely paralyzed right arm. As we've heard, Senator Dole wanted to be a doctor. He was a great track star in Russell and at the University of Kansas. But after that event in 1945, his life, even the basic tasks of living, they were not the story of a track star or a young man who saw stability in being a doctor in a small town. His dreams were crippled. All of us grow up with dreams, and his were shattered on one day. He endured these disabilities throughout his life. You could never see him talk to Bob Dole without knowing the experience of his disability, which he never let be one. It took us a number of times to figure out in my life, particularly as a teenager, how do I get to shake Bob Dole's hand? How does this work? He lived with these disabilities, and rather than asking for help, he decided to commit his life to offering help. His disabilities developed his character, it developed an empathy for other people, and he turned his adversities into public service. His circumstances altered the course of his life, leading him to Congress, where he championed bills to provide hope to people like him. There may be no more important thing that any of us can give anyone else, maybe with the exception of what the chaplain offers, but the hope. And maybe what the chaplain offers is hope. In addition to his World War II service, Senator Dole's character developed due to his upbringing here in Kansas, here in Russell, Kansas. His family and this community endured the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. In Russell, you could feel and see the challenges, the obstacles, the barriers that were put in people's life. Nothing was easy. He wanted to be a doctor because it looked to him like the doctor was the only one who had a stable income. Roger. Even after Bob Dole became a household name across the country, he always returned to Russell. Following his injuries, he returned to Russell. After receiving the vice presidential nomination, he and the president came to Russell. The 3 presidential campaigns, he came to Russell, I went to Iowa 3 times on a bus, as lots of Kansans did. After his death of Kenny, his brother, he came to Russell. In 1996, members of his hometown gathered here to celebrate his birthday just after he had been defeated by Bill Clinton. Though a national leader, he would always be a son of the Kansas Plains. This is what Bob Dole said. The first thing you learn on the prairie is the realization. Let me say that differently. The first thing you learn on the prairie is the relative size of a man compared to the lay of the land. The chaplain talked about our distances, the sky, the horizons. The first thing you learn on the prairie is the relative size of a man compared to the lay of the land. And under the immense sky where I was born and raised, a man is very small. And if he thinks otherwise, he's wrong. This place that many of us call home, is a place that puts us in perspective. Russ Townsley, who Senator Roberts mentioned, the former publisher of the Russell Daily News, wrote regarding Senator Dole's decision to make his announcement to run for president from a stage in Russell. The national media was making fun of this kind of thing. Why would you announce your presidency in Russell? You're going to carry Russell County. And here's what Russ Towns had to say. Skeptics ask what Bob Dole can hope to gain from this public show of professionally staged rally. And this is where the skeptics find themselves traveling blind. There's no need to look for ulterior motives, for there are none. Dole and his town gain from each other, while one draws on unseen reserves that have nurtured him from childhood. The other grows strong from the aura reflected from his image of leadership and stature by the other. To the people of Russell, to the people of Kansas, thank you for the manner in which you have shaped, treated, respected a man now so worthy of our admiration. This town should be so proud, because none of us come from places and become anything but from what we came from. We never escape. We don't become somebody different than where our roots lie. We mourn our man Bob. It can feel like the sun is setting on both the man and the greatest generation that he embodied. Bob Dole, perhaps the greatest man of the greatest generation. On Thursday, I stood in the rotunda of the United States Capitol as Senator Dole lied in state. He was on a platform, incidentally, that President Lincoln laid on upon his death. Only 33 people have lied in state in that rotunda. Your hometown boy, Bob Dole, is one of them. The statue of his hero, his commanding general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, looks over that room and looked over all of us as we gathered to pay tribute to Bob Dole. I've debated whether to express concern, always be optimistic, but I'm worried. I'm concerned if America ever again will experience the civility, the bravery, the empathy, the character of people like President Eisenhower and Senator Dole. What happens when the greatest generation is absent? But I'm relieved to receive the care and benefits they deserve. Hope that the aged would live their remaining years with dignity. In that 1996 comments from the senator on the Senate floor as he left the United States Senate for the last time as a senator, he said, I agree with a prairie poet, he was speaking of Carl Sandburg, who said, yesterday is a wind gone down, a sun dropped in the west, and I tell you that there is nothing in the world, only an ocean of tomorrows, only a sky of tomorrows. And like everybody here, I'm an optimist, and I believe our best tomorrows are yet to be lived. My hope is the life of Senator Bob Dole will be remembered, carried on in towns across America, in the hearts and minds of people here and around the world, brave enough to find freedom worth defending, and in the halls of our government, where there is a new generation, where that new generation, like Senator Dole, will help make tomorrow better for their fellow citizen. I started my remarks by sharing how much Bob Dole meant to Kansans. This week we were also reminded how much Bob Dole meant to Americans. One of the places Senator Roberts mentioned in World War II. We saw this week thousands of people gathered to pay their respects to Bob Dole at the World War II. You see it every day, hundreds of Americans, veterans and families, citizens who respect and admire their service. They're there at the World War II Memorial to say thanks. I didn't mention earlier as I described my first connection with Senator Dole, but the first I heard the story of my dad searching for Bob Dole in Italy was when my dad told the story to Bob Dole, because my dad was on an honor flight at the World World War II memorial. My dad in his early 90s, Senator Dole in his 80s, just two old veterans talking about the past. That memorial that Senator Dole gave us creates a point in which we all come together and it helps change lives now, today, and in the future. Senator Dole had this memorial built in honor of veterans like my dad. And because of that, we will be reminded of the service and sacrifice for generations to come. Across the nation. Well, let me tell one more story. I'm sure my 10 minutes up. Pat Roberts was short. My wife is shaking her head yes, or my 10 minutes are up. Pat Roberts, he was shorter than usual, so I'm taking his very rare attention. When I get frustrated with things in the nation's capital hall, I'll walk down to the Lincoln Memorial. And on that trip, I will now go by the World War II Memorial, I'll go by the Vietnam Wall, I'll see the Lincoln Memorial, I'll come back by the Freedom Memorial. And I was there one day, this is right before the World War II Memorial opened. And I found the Kansas pillar, and I stepped away from the memorial and used my cell phone to call my dad. This is something that the memorial does, because I would never tell my dad this in person. I wouldn't voluntarily say what I said to my dad that day. And fortunately for me, I got an answering machine, so it was not a problem to leave a message. But I said, Dad, I'm at the World War II Memorial. This memorial was built in your honor. And Dad, I want you to know, I thank you for your service. I respect you. And Dad, I love you. That memorial caused that conversation to occur, which probably would not occur. Incidentally, I'm walking back to my office, and my cell phone rings. And I answer it. It's my dad's voice, and he says, Gerald? I said, yes. And he said, you left me a message, but I couldn't understand it. Would you repeat? Across the nation, people remember Bob Dole for campaigns and presidential races and service in the Senate and legislation passed. I will always remember Bob Dole as the serviceman, the person who sacrificed so much for the rest of us in the military. And will always remember his roots. David Rogers covered Congress for the Wall Street Journal, traveled to Russell in 1988. And he said, like the outcroppings of bleached stone on the prairie grass, there's a hardness to this land, and it shows in Russell's native son, Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole. Pat mentioned he spoke to a high school class graduation in 1986, and Senator Dole said of his own powerful ambition to chase flat horizons and grasp the dreams that lie beyond. He said, I've come from a very special place. The horizon is out there somewhere, and you just keep chasing and looking for it, working for it to make your mark, not only on Kansas, but on America. Bob Dole suffered, he endured, and he developed character that gave him and us hope. I'm honored to serve in the Dole seat in the United States Senate and use the Dole desk where I see his name etched into the bottom of the desk drawer every day. It reminds me of the man who went before me, and that each of us can chase the horizon and make our mark on Kansas and the country. Bob Dole has reached his final horizon. He promised us he'd be setting up above us. He's watching, and he said he'd be full of optimism and hope. C.J. Mahoney, who was my first intern in the House of Representatives, a Russell native, sent me a comic, a cartoon that appeared in some nation's paper today, and it teared me up this morning. The cartoon is Bob Dole standing in front of the pearly gates, and he's talking to St. Peter, and the caption is, for the first time, Bob Dole can again salute his country with his right arm. Isn't that something that is to celebrate? Bob Dole, Robert J. Dole, gives us hope for a brighter and better tomorrow. We say thank you. I can't say it to my dad, Bob Dole, And I can't say it to you, except in this symbolic way, but we can say it to all those who served our country. We say this today. Senator Dole, I respect you. I thank you for your service, and we love you. Thank you.